the Traumdeutung, Traumdeutung. Just Google that and get an English translation. I'm sure it's available free online. Get this. Everyone can submit his own dreams to analytic examination, and now where are you going to learn this? The technique of interpreting dreams may be easily learned. Really? Where? From the instructions and examples which I have given. You want to learn dream interpretation? Go to Freud. Read Freud's essay. You'll know how to interpret dreams. I must once more insist, just as I did at that time, a thorough investigation of the problems of dreams is an indispensable prerequisite for any comprehension of the mental processes in hysteria and other psychoneuroses. So, a thorough investigation of the problems of dreams has to happen. It's prerequisite to figure out hysteria and other psychoneuroses. That no one wishes to shirk that preparatory labor has the smallest prospect of advancing even a few steps into this region of knowledge. In other words, you can't even start down the path of figuring out psychological problems and neuroses and stuff. You can't even start down this path unless you're going to use dreams as your windows and as your way to figure things out. A person who won't look into dreams and learn how to interpret dreams, quote, has the smallest prospect of advancing into this region of knowledge. You have no prospect of going into this region of knowledge. Okay. Now, maybe you buy that at this point, and maybe you think that's a bit bizarre. But his next sentence is very telling. Since, therefore, this case history, Dora, presupposes a knowledge of the interpretation of dreams, it will seem highly unsatisfactory to any reader to whom this presupposition does not apply. So he's putting a caveat right there in the first few pages of the work. He says, if you don't know about the work I've done on dream interpretation, then you're not going to think much of this case study. That's true. Bingo. But I'll add one thing. Your work on dream interpretation, Mr. Freud, is nonsense. I haven't read it, but it couldn't be anything else. Such a reader, a person who doesn't know much about dream interpretation, will find only bewilderment in these pages instead of the enlightenment he is in search of, and he will certainly be inclined to project the cause of his bewilderment onto the author and pronounce the author's views fantastic. Fantastic meaning as in fantasy. Alright, he says if you're not convinced and don't believe in dream interpretation, then you're going to think that my case history here is bewildering and bizarre and mere fantasy made up out of whole cloth. Yeah, okay. We skip about a page. Now he's been trying to help people that have mental problems for a while. And he talks about this technique he used to use. At that time, the work of analysis started out from the symptoms and aimed at clearing them up one after another. So you come to Freud with symptoms. You say, I'm nervous, I can't sleep at night, I wake up with nightmares, I'm vomiting. So he tries to cure those. But since then, I have abandoned that technique because I found it totally inadequate for dealing with the finer structure of neuroses. So there's something more going on, and he has to do more than just try to clear up the symptoms. And that's imaginable, right? Someone comes to you with cancer, if you're a doctor. They come in and they say, Doctor, I can't eat, I'm throwing up. Well, let's try to, let's see, we'll get you some pot. You smoke pot and you'll get the munchies and that'll help, and then you'll be able to eat, right? That's not going to cure the cancer. So, actually, ironically, smoking weed is used for people who are having their cancer worked on with, what is it, chemotherapy. And chemotherapy makes you throw up and you're not hungry, so that patients lose physical stature, they become weak, they become unable, their body becomes unable to even fight, and and some of them die of like essentially net malnutrition. There was a Republican congressman whose 9 or 10-year-old son had cancer and was undergoing chemotherapy, and the congressman went out on the black market and bought some marijuana and had his son smoke it. And he said, a few minutes after his son had smoked, he said, "I heard the most wonderful thing from my son that I hadn't heard in so long." He said, "I'm hungry." Anyways, how did we get off on that? So there's a finer structure of neuroses that he has to deal with, right? This is plausible. So what does he do now? Instead of just dealing with the problems they come with and trying to solve those, he, quote, lets the patient himself choose the subject of the day's work. And in that way I start out from whatever surface his unconscious happens to be presenting to his notice at the moment. So it's almost like mysticism, or like reading cards, tarot cards or something. Whatever comes up, anything that comes up, we'll work with that, with no larger plan. This is brilliant, right? Brilliant. But on this plan, everything that has to do with the clearing up of a particular symptom emerges piecemeal, woven into various contexts and distributed over widely separated periods of time. In spite of this apparent disadvantage, the new technique is far superior to the old, and indeed there can be no doubt that it is the only possible technique. Oh, really? Simply letting the patient talk about whatever he wants when he comes in is the only possible technique for curing neuroses. Strange. I have as a rule not reproduced the process of interpretation to which the patient's associations and communications had to be subjected, but only the results of that process. Now that's odd. As I was saying earlier, this is a clinical situation. This is a medical document, supposedly. And it gave rise to a branch of medicine, supposedly. Not this document, but Freud's writings. And he does not reproduce the process of interpretation, but just the results of that process. Now that's very weird. You don't get away with that in science. You don't come out and say, "Here are my results," and people say, "Well, how did you get those results?" Don't worry. That's weird. That's weird. I say to that, I say, Alright, on to part 2, chapter 2. That was only a 7-page chapter. The second chapter is called The Clinical Picture. And he starts off mentioning, in my Traumdeutung, that was his essay about dreams, published in 1900, I showed that dreams in general can be interpreted. Okay. And that after the work of interpretation has been completed, they can be replaced by perfectly correctly structured thoughts which find a recognizable position in the texture of the mind. And he does all of this while regarding reason, a strict obeyance of reason and logic, regarding that as irrational, unbalanced, and what was the other word? You can't be too reasonable. That's unreasonable to be too reasonable. Okay, so he can figure out dreams and he can replace them with perfectly correctly structured thoughts. Now, I don't know how you figure out how to structure thoughts or how they're perfectly correctly structured or whatever if you're against reason in the way that he's already said he is. But you can get this. I wish to give an example in the following pages of the only practical application of which the art of interpreting dreams seems to admit. In other words, the interpretation of dreams has one and only one legitimate use, and that's the use that I'm using it for, which is to psychoanalyze people, and I'm going to give you an example of that in the coming pages. The assertions are thick, and they come one after another. And do you think that the essay on dreams is any better? I take leave to doubt it.